Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a deep, science-backed dive to completely demystify the complex concepts of human sexuality and identity. We're moving way beyond those rigid binary boxes to really get a handle on what I like to call the spectrum of us.
To tackle this, we've got a pretty straightforward agenda today. We'll kick things off with sex versus gender, dive into the biology of sex, explore identity and expression, unpack roles, stereotypes, and reality, and finally wrap up with the androgynous mind. Let's get right to it.
Okay, so let's tackle the biggest assumption right out of the gate. Are sex and gender the exact same thing? I mean, in everyday conversation, people swap these terms all the time, right? Like they're totally interchangeable. But scientifically and sociologically, they actually reflect very different aspects of who we are.
Section 1. Sex versus gender. Biological versus constructed. It's incredibly helpful to draw a hard line between these two concepts. Think of it like this. Sex is your biological hardware. It's determined by your chromosomes, your hormonal profiles, and your anatomy. Gender, on the other hand, is a cultural construct. It's all about the roles, the behaviors, and the expectations that a specific society slaps a masculine or feminine label on. So biology builds the foundation, but culture really shapes the gender expression on top of it.
Section 2. The biology of sex. Chromosomes and anatomy.
So your biological sex is actually determined by your DNA right at the very moment of conception. Typically, an XX chromosome combination sets off female development, while an XY combination triggers male development, usually through the release of androgens, which are male hormones. Now, this chromosomal setup is a great evolutionary trick for species survival, sure. But here's the thing, biology absolutely loves variation. Nature doesn't always neatly divide us into just XX or XY.
In fact, chromosomal variations are surprisingly common naturally. Let's compare two of the most frequent ones to get a clearer picture. First, there's Klinefelter syndrome, which affects about 1 in 500 male babies. This involves an extra X chromosome and XXY configuration, and it brings unique physical traits, like a slightly more rounded body type and a lack of facial hair. On the flip side, Turner syndrome affects roughly 1 in 2,000 to 2,500 female babies. This happens when there's only a single X chromosome, and it often presents as a shorter stature and a lack of typical puberty development.
Seeing these genetic variations mapped out physically really grounds the clinical data in reality, doesn't it? But, and this is absolutely crucial to note, virtually all of these physical manifestations are highly treatable. With the right medical care, hormone treatments, and monitoring, folks with these genetic variations absolutely can and do live normal, completely healthy lives.
Beyond just the chromosomes, we also see biological variation in anatomical development. Some folks are born intersex. This means their sexual anatomy actually combines features of both sexes. It simply can't be neatly boxed into exclusively male or female. This usually happens in one of three ways. You might have a genetic male with female external genitals, a genetic female with male external genitals, or a genetic female with ambiguous genitals. This very natural reality is exactly why the traditional practice of surgically altering an infant's genitalia is incredibly controversial today. A lot of critics argue, quite strongly, that these babies should be left intact so they can decide for themselves once they reach adulthood.
Section 3. Identity and expression. Psychological perception.
Now let's talk about the psychological side of things. A transgender individual is someone whose internal gender identity simply doesn't align with their biological birth sex, and when that mismatch causes significant clinical distress, doctors refer to it as gender dysphoria. To put some scale to this, the CDC estimates that about 4.5% of people in the US identify as transgender. It just means their internal psychological identity doesn't conform to their biological hardware. And it's really important to highlight that clinical therapy today isn't designed to cure them, it's there to help them understand, navigate, and fully accept themselves.
For plenty of other folks, identity isn't strictly male or female at all. This is where the non-binary umbrella comes into play. These individuals just don't feel like they fit neatly into those standard traditional categories of man or woman. They might feel like a mix of both, neither, or experience their gender as something completely fluid. They'll often use pronouns like they and them. And it's super important to realize they aren't somehow lacking a gender. They're just sitting somewhere else entirely on the spectrum.
And here's a massive point. We absolutely have to distinguish our internal identity from our outward attraction. Human sexual identity is profoundly complex. Your biological sex, your gender identity, and your sexual orientation are completely separate dimensions that just happen to interact with each other. For example, a transgender woman, someone who is biologically male but has a feminine gender identity, might be primarily attracted to women, which means she'd consider herself a lesbian.
You can literally live your life as any one of a seemingly infinite number of potential combinations.
Section 4. Roles, Stereotypes, and Reality. Culture versus reality.
From the exact moment we're born, we are just bombarded with socialized expectations. Honestly, nowhere is this more obvious than on TV, which heavily pushes these stark, stereotypical contrasts. Men are usually portrayed as dominant, rational, and even violent, making up roughly 65% of all TV characters. Women, on the flip side, are typically painted as sensitive, romantic, and submissive. These massive cultural stereotypes don't just exist in a vacuum. They heavily guide our children's social, educational, and professional choices as they grow up.
But what actually happens when we test these stereotypes against the data? Take the incredibly common myth that boys are just naturally more aggressive. Well, the data totally shatters that illusion. It proves that while boys do heavily lean toward physical and direct verbal aggression, girls are absolutely still highly aggressive, they just shift their tactics. They tend to use relational aggression, things like social ostracism and spreading malicious rumors. So the aggression is 100% still there, it just takes on a different cultural form.
Which brings us to a recurring mental model you absolutely need to remember when you hear any stereotype: the overlapping curve model. This statistical reality proves that while the averages between men and women might differ slightly for a specific trait, the vast majority of individuals from both groups heavily overlap. Simply put, extreme black and white differences between genders are actually incredibly rare in the real world.
Let me break down exactly what that looks like. Take the stereotype that men just naturally have a higher sex drive. If we look at the distributions, sure, the average for men might sit slightly higher than the average for women. But check out that massive overlapping shaded area in the middle. That huge overlap literally means there are millions of women who have a higher sexual interest than millions of men. The difference is nowhere near as absolute as the stereotype wants us to believe.
Section 5. The Androgynous Mind. Beyond the Binary.
For the longest time, society operated on the assumption that you had to pick a side. You were either strictly masculine or strictly feminine. But the two-dimensional model of gender suggests something totally different, that people can actually manifest elements of multiple genders at the exact same time. We call this androgyny. Back in the 1970s, psychologists realized something pretty revolutionary. People who score highly on both masculine and feminine traits, people who possess an androgynous mind, are generally happier, they're better adjusted, and they're even more popular.
Now, if you take a second to assess your own traits, you might realize that being androgynous doesn't automatically mean you're perfectly balanced. What you really want to cultivate is positive androgyny. This means grabbing the best of both worlds, like being patient, a traditionally feminine trait, while also being firm, a traditionally masculine trait. The whole goal is to leverage these ideal traits rather than falling into negative, undesirable extremes, like being chronically worried and aggressively bossy. It's really all about taking the very best traits from across the entire gender spectrum to become a truly well-rounded human being.
When we finally strip away those rigid cultural stereotypes and look closely at the biological, psychological, and sociological facts we've explored today, we don't find two isolated, completely separate boxes. No. What we find is a rich, beautifully overlapping human spectrum, and that invites every single one of us to ask ourselves this final question: where do you fall on the spectrum of us? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember, always keep questioning what you think you know.